I'd like to introduce this morning Dean Otino. He is the Dean of the McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Northwestern University, where he holds the title of Distinguished Robert McCormick Institute Professor and Walter P. Murphy Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering. His research has been featured in articles and on the covers of Nature, Science, Scientific American, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, and other publications. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is the recipient of numerous national awards, including the Fluid Dynamics Prize from the American Physical Society. In 2008, he was also selected by the AICHE as one of the 100 engineers of the modern era. Otino received his PhD in chemical engineering at the University of Minnesota and held positions at UMass Amherst and chaired and had senior appointments at Caltech and Stanford. Dean Otino is also an artist, and we have here some examples of his work. He's exhibited these works, and he's currently working on a book of the processes that connect technology, business, and the arts. So if you could please join me in welcoming Julio Martinez.
I'm delighted to be here. It's very gutsy of you to invite the Dean of Engineering to give your talk. So, some of those paintings I did, there were at least a couple when I was about 16. So, as to how is that I ended up doing that, kind of a 1-minute introduction to that. My mother was an artist, and my father was a professor. Shortly after having 2 kids, she stopped, but I grew up with that, okay? And my father was a professor, and in Argentina, where I grew up, you are a professor of a topic. He was histology and embryology. So I had those 2 things. Then I grew up in a time in which things were very, very turbulent in Argentina. Shortly before coming here, and I was kind of in the middle of this, I was an officer in the Navy. And this is a time in which about 30,000 people vanished in Argentina from the right and the left, okay? So I had 2 things that were important to me at that time. One was math, because it was so pure, perfect. Everything around me was not very perfect. It was very, very turbulent. And the other thing that was cathartic for me was art. And as you can see, the paintings were not very happy paintings. They are not like, De Chirico will be someone, German Expressionism will be similar to that, but I never developed much of a taste for Monet or people like that. So is the volume now okay? It's okay? Okay, so what I'm going to tell you is not very different than, for example, the last big talk I gave, actually I gave 3, was in Singapore. I don't know how many of you have been to Singapore. Okay, Singapore is a place in which there is no difference, no separation between the corporate sector and the private sector and academia, okay? There are 2 major universities, and I was there to give a keynote to the board of trustees of one of the universities. Very, very impressive group. The chair was the former CEO of Singapore Airlines. And basically what they wanted to know was my opinion on how to increase creativity in Singapore. Singapore is, if it was a company, and you put it in the list of the top companies, and you put the GDP with the market capitalization, will be about 12. Same size of Israel, same size of Finland, very different approaches. If you want to establish a headquarters of something or a branch, it's the most friendly place for business. They don't produce many startups. Israel produces a lot, but have not produced big companies. Finland at least has produced 1 big company that now is not doing that well, Nokia. Very different, but it's very, very well choreographed. It's like, I don't know, walking inside Neiman Marcos, kind of. It's very perfect. But the main reason I'm telling you this is something of what I'm going to tell you is what I told them. I probably play down the art part less in there, but what I'm about to tell you is basically three things. I'm going to first give you a sense of what is that I'm going to be telling you about. One is going way back when, before art separated from science. In the second part, I will tell you about moments of confluence and tell you how these domains of art, technology, and science evolve, what makes them similar, what makes them different. And then I end up with lessons. And in the lessons, I'm going to put myself in the side of art and see if there are lessons that transfer to the other domains, okay? So the first thing, creativity. Creativity is now highly idealized, and if you're in art, you mystify how creativity in science works, and if you are in science, you mystify how creativity in the art side works, and they are both usually wrong. Creativity is very much connected with the myth of epiphany, that somehow an idea suddenly appears out of nowhere. Before the Renaissance, this was attributed to the Muses. That's why we do not know who created some of the things that are most memorable now. For example, the Pantheon in Rome, we know who commissioned it. We have no idea about the architect. And the idea that some people are kind of touched from above, bestowed with creative ideas, there is some validity to that. But the idea that somehow scientific creativity moves on a lower plane as artistic creativity has been there for a long time. And for example, Kant would argue that in someone like Newton, that I showed before with the apple, inspired by that, which by the way was an invention of the French, the myth of the apple. No such thing ever happened. He thought that in scientific endeavors, you could follow rationally how ideas came about and learn from that, whereas in poetry, no matter how many examples you look at, and he looked at Homer, probably not the best example because Homer is like a composite figure now we know, you will not learn how to write poetry in that way. So the idea of geniuses is in there, and I presume someone could give the same talk that I'm about to give by sitting on the side of music or sitting in the side of literature. But there are people who were bestowed with early creativity. Rimbaud is one. By about 20, he kind of closed shop, devoted himself to something else. And Mozart is the other example. But if you really want to look at the cases where things happened with the least amount of training, sometimes, the best example, and you could give an entire talk on this, is the discipline where the word beauty will appear the most associated with what people do, is actually math. In mathematics, there are examples of creativity that seemingly appears from nowhere. I gave before Singapore, I was in IIT Bombay. You know, the IIT, there is a pecking order, and at the top of the heap is IIT Bombay. And I was glad to give a talk in there because the director of IIT Bombay is one of my students. So in India, that counts for a lot, okay? This fellow never received training in math. He sent a stack of papers to the greatest mathematician of his time, who was based in England. This fellow went to lunch with one of his colleagues. They could see that some things were trivial, but some other ones it took a lifetime to prove. And then there is an example. By the way, he was a strict vegetarian, and living in England in the 30s was not a good place to be. So he died very young. He died basically of malnutrition. Had time to go back to India and died very young. And the other one, which is even more tragic, is this fellow Galois. Galois failed twice to enter in the most prestigious French academies. And at some point, he was going to a duel, and the night before the duel, he wrote several pages with what became the foundations of group theory. There is a quote there by Hermann Weyl, who says that the 60 pages that he wrote, that his entire production, were the most important pages ever written in the literature of mankind. That's not something that you see often. And he died at 20. And so this is the category of genius, okay? But these are like the exceptions to the rule. Now, if you put these three domains, art, technology, and science, and if I ask you to assign the words creation, invention, and discovery to each of them, you will probably do something like this. Science is basically about discovery, technology is about invention, and I think many people will assign art to creation, except that no artist will describe what they do as creation. Creation is a byproduct. It's actually for amateurs to assign creation to art. They will use words like transform, reveal, provoke, many other ones, but creation is a byproduct. Now, I want to go back to the point in which things had not bifurcated, in which art and science, even though science, the term had not been invented yet, it was called natural philosophy, before they split. So for someone like Da Vinci, art and science were two different ways of exploring the world. They were undistinguishable. They were two means in which to investigate things. And this went on, and I'm going to describe two moments in which lots of things sort of had a point of confluence. And one was the Renaissance. Okay? So the first story is Galileo. Galileo is probably the most important figure in physics. Is at the same level of Einstein or Newton. So I'm going to give you a kind of very brief kind of vignette about him. And the vignette is when Galileo decided to explore the heavens by means of a telescope. So telescopes were the range, they were being manufactured in Holland, what is now Holland. And Galileo was a very good mathematician, but he was also a good experimentalist and had built his own telescope. And almost at the same time as this fellow Thomas Harriot, he decided to look at things. He discovered, for example, that Jupiter had moons, but he also looked at the moon. The moon, prior to Galileo, was regarded as a perfect celestial object, a perfect sphere. You can see with the naked eyes that there are spots in there. They had all sorts of explanations of why the spots. Some were that the moon was a perfect mirror, and what you saw on the moon was the reflections of the Earth. The other one, it was something like made of kind of alabaster or something like that, and you could see the inside. It was something that typified purity. The Virgin was often depicted on top of the moon in paintings. So when they both saw the moon, and they both saw the same thing, Galileo and Harriot could infer different consequences. And the consequences were due that they were both living in different environments. Galileo was in Florence, and Harriot was in London. In Florence, if you are an architect, a painter, you were trained in La Accademia del Disegno. Okay, La Accademia del Disegno was a place that brought all of these disciplines together. There was a post for a mathematician. Galileo applied for that, and actually he failed. Eventually he was admitted, but he was admitted based on his strength as painter. But if you are there, you were subject to lots of exercises on perspective. So people could do objects like this. In fact, several of these, there was an exhibit probably 2 years ago at the Bloch Museum. Some of these, I saw some of the real things in there. And they could see what shadows they will project. They were almost like theorems that people will prove you are trained on this. You are soaking up this kind of knowledge. Galileo was deeply immersed in this. So when they both saw the moon, on the left in there is what Harriot drew, and on the right you see watercolors that Galileo drew as he was looking. But Galileo immediately recognized that those shadows that he was seeing were craters. He was even able to calculate the height of the craters of the moon. And poor Harriot, since he didn't have that training, he saw it, but didn't infer. So, but Galileo did more than that. Galileo was the first person who studied motions of objects. You remember the famous experiment of drawing something from the Tower of Pisa. He's the one who put math in physics. So after that, math became more and more prevalent as a natural language for physics and discovering how the heavens work. And this reached a sort of culmination in works like Laplace that infer how celestial bodies move. It was all about rationality. Napoleon got a volume of this, actually 3 volumes of the celestial physics, and he asked, I see no mention of God in here. And he said, sir, I have no need for that hypothesis in here. It was all about rationality. There was another fellow named Lagrange who boasted that his entire work will contain no figures. Figures were kind of supposed to water down the serious thinking that was couched in math, okay? And eventually, you could see now, this is 300 years ago, okay, 350, 500 really, people who are thinking in visual terms and no visual terms. And both camps look really good. On the left, for example, you see Heisenberg, the one of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. He thought that quantum mechanics was being diluted by drawing pictures, but on the right you see Richard Feynman, who was at Caltech, probably the smartest recent physicist, who was very much into the picture side, as was Einstein. But the two camps bifurcated. Galileo was the best example of art in the service of science, and he's the guy who bifurcated it by science became completely disjointed from visual parts and art. So I'm going to now give you a synopsis about origins. So we are talking about art, technology, and science. So art is as old as humanity, and technology, by the time that you build a second axe, you are doing technology, and you are doing technology before there were disciplines fully formed in engineering. The Roman aqueducts, that one is in Segovia, is still standing. The Pantheon is still standing, but as I mentioned, we have no idea who designed them. Science, by comparison, is a baby. 500 years old with Galileo, 350 with the birth of the first society devoted to science, the Royal Academy of London. In fact, very rarely we know this, the word scientist was coined for the first time in 1834. Before that, there was no word for people who did the equivalent of science. They were natural philosophers, but the word science didn't exist. In this day and age, since you can scan every book, well, this is about 15% of the books have written in English. They have been scanned by Google. And this is the frequency with which the words art, technology, and science appear. The word technology, for example, we know who was the first president who mentioned the word technology twice. It was Ronald Reagan. It's not that old, okay? And you can see before 1920, the word technology barely existed. Now, how do these things grow? This is kind of sketchy, but the biggest discovery of science is science itself, is the way that science grows. There are very few dead branches in science. In fact, the branches will die because people find them not promising, or because people make claims that they later on are disproven. In fact, the bigger the claim, you hear about fraud in science. Well, the bigger the claim, the fastest it will be debunked. Okay? Most people here in this university are putting more layers in the edifice of science. If you are lucky, one of them will discover that something that was claimed by someone really big was wrong. You will get in the press by that, okay? So you move up constantly. There are a few revolutions in between, quantum mechanics, relativity, and so on. Standing in the shoulders of giants is a good idea in science. Newton was the one who claimed, I did what I did because I was standing on the shoulders of giants. Apparently, he said that with a double meaning. One of his main rivals was Robert Hooke, and Robert Hooke was kind of, Newton was not a nice man, okay? The only reason that you will stand on the shoulders of someone in technology is to crush that someone. Technology gets displaced by another technology. You don't wait until they kind of run its course. You try to start before. And in art, it's extremely bad to be associated with standing on the shoulders of anybody. So it's kind of more, if you could paint even like Renoir now, that will not get you far. It has been done, okay? So, whereas in technology, if I were showing you objects, technological objects, or in science, I was showing you discoveries, even if you came from another galaxy and you were smart, you will be able to kind of put them in the right chronological order. One builds on the other one. In art, no such thing, especially as you approach the second part of the 20th century and the 21st. So all of those paintings are in between 1890, 1950. Here more. That's Jack Close. More. That one is in the Smith College Art Museum. It's Charles Schiller. These two. But these two were done by the same person. So unless you have taken several courses in history of art, you couldn't put them in chronological order. Whereas in science, you see the evolution. So even though there is a paradox in here, in science, you normally see the end product. You don't see the drafts. You see the final thing. Once in a while, you will see the edited copy of a book or how Beethoven did markings in something, but you see the final thing. Whereas in visual arts, everything that you have done survives. In fact, the job of a curator is show evolution of things, sometimes show evolution of Matisse and Gauguin, kind of in parallel. So, but how does something become accepted and form part of the canon? And what by something I mean science, technology. The most democratic is technology. We all decide what become part of accepted things in technology. There are two things in here. One is the domain. The domain is everything that has been written, published, exhibited, reviews, what would exist even if human beings were not here. And then the gatekeepers of the domain is the field. And the field is inhabited by people who make judgments about things. What should be published? What should be exhibited? So something becomes part of the domain when the field collectively decides that should be part of it. That doesn't mean that it's a forever proposition. It probably is revised, but that's how things get accepted in there. So I mentioned that paradoxically, in art is where creativity kind of lives in the minds of many, and where the burst of an idea is the important thing. So this was not always so, but in the Renaissance, the first thought, the primo pensieri in Italian, is what became a pride possession. By the way, there was an exhibit of this also in the blog, of these sketches that eventually became more evolved, and this became sort of something that was equivalent of a trademark or intellectual property, and is what eventually will be given to someone, maybe the painter itself, an assistant, and will become something like that. But the first thought was that first sketch became valuable in the Renaissance. Before that, no. But paradoxically, even though in technology, you could order things. And in art, now you could not order the overall production. Within a given person, you could do the ordering. And you could do it in many fields, but I'm going to kind of focus on visual arts. So this is one sketch, 2 sketches, 3 sketches, there were many. So for example, this is Picasso. For Guernica, Picasso did about 43 sketches. Why? Because he was with Dora Maar and she took photographs of each of them. Okay? Eventually, it became that, which is at the MoMA. But in science, there is not such a thing. You don't see the evolution. In fact, you probably know the guy on the right, probably not so much the guy on the left, but the guy on the left was a very famous physicist, and they both describe the same thing. When you reach the end, the pinnacle, the major discovery, you are given the speech and the Nobel Prize, when you are awarded the Nobel Prize and you describe how is that you did what you did? He said, Helmholtz, you describe a royal path, but you never describe the shaky ladder that took you there, all the tentative steps. Heidegger, who, by the way, he had a degree in engineering, okay? Aeronautical engineering. Most famous philosopher in the 1920s, 30s. He was even more depictive in what he said, you arrive at the top and then you kick the ladder. Or the one who put it in the best terms, the secret of creativity is knowing how to hide your sources. That was Einstein. And we do a disservice, by the way, in science by sort of a footnote. In science, we teach perfection. Everything that you learn was perfect, perfectly constructed. We load people up with this, and then at the end we tell them, okay, now it's your turn to be creative. Whereas in art, it's the opposite. We ask people to be original, and then strive for perfection in their own way at the end. So, as I said, part of what I'm telling you here is in different words maybe, what I was telling people, well, Singapore, but I have given talks to corporate boards, is about reading the future, okay? And part of reading the future has to be that to handle the future, you need more inspiration. But my attitude about reading the future is that life is like an impenetrable fog, okay? In front of us, we see only 5 feet, but in the rear view mirror, everything is clear, okay? Everything can see the past. Very few people can see the future, okay? And if I want to put this in a more kind of business-like setting, every 2 years, IBM does a survey, and they publish the results, and the results are supposed to have a half-time of 3 to 5 years. So about 2 years ago, they did a survey and they asked a question about 1,500 CEOs. What's the issue that keeps you awake at night? And the number one answer was the complexity that we live with. Complexity was the number one concern. And the other question was, what's the most important leadership skill for leaders in the future? And the number one answer was creativity. Okay? So that's how I link it when I give these other kind of talks. So defy complexity with creativity. So let me kind of give you like a 1-minute explanation of what we mean by complexity, okay? This is one example. There could be thousands of other examples. You will see them reflected in one figure. So there is one problem. Let's say that the problem is the diminishing population of cod in the North Atlantic, okay? Now, the press wants to find a reason for this, so they ask questions and they condense this in a very simple explanation, and we know that the cod eats crustaceans, but the cod is eaten by harp seals. So the easiest villain in the story could be either that the crustaceans are kind of being wiped out, or that the harp seals are growing too much and they are eating the cod. So eventually, in the press was the harp seals are getting too abundant. But in many ecosystems, And as I said, this is one example having to do with kind of ecology, but there could be other ones. Every species that is living in the North Atlantic has been kind of documented, and we know who is what. So there are arrows connecting species, okay? This, it's that other thing, it's this other thing. And when you put all of them together, it kind of looks like that. And that's the code, the herb seals and the crustaceans in there. If you think that by that linear reasoning, you can understand how the whole connected system behaves, you are deceiving yourself. But the point is that the world is becoming like this. Supply chains, interconnectedness of all kinds. You see the prevalence of social networks and connectivity. The only way, by the way, and this is a plug for something that we're doing now, the only way to make sense of this, intuition doesn't help you, is to have more tools, and the tools are called analytics. Okay? That's what you need to make sense of this. And all of this lives in complexity. So we are good in designing things that have thousands of parts, even millions of parts. An airplane has millions of parts. But each part has been designed to fulfill a function. And if that part fails, you better have a backup, because the part will not suddenly transform into something else. Biology does that, but not systems that we design from the ground up. Whereas a clock is like that. That's a metaphor for work like clockwork, is because each piece is working with the other pieces. But you don't build a clock, put the last little gear, and somehow the clock becomes alive, develops little feet, and walks away. But that's how a cell will operate. Okay, at some point. So that's the difference between complicated and complex. Now, about the confluence of things. Okay, I like this quote. It's not widely popular, but he gave an interview, and I think that there is actually very little distinction between an artist, a scientist, or an engineer of the highest caliber. And I deeply believe this. Okay? One example, Morse. This is one of the Morse code, telegraph. You think that he was technical, an engineer. In fact, he took only one course in Yale that had to do with anything close to physics or engineering. One course in electricity, okay? Because that's what was known at the time. The story is that he was painting in Washington. He was a very accomplished painter, accomplished enough that he was a member of the Royal Academy in England, Royal Academy of Arts. And the story is that someone came by horse to give a note to him that your wife is gravely ill, you should return home. Now, home was in New Haven. By the time that he arrived, his wife was dead. Now, he started thinking about better ways of transferring news, and he was lucky enough that there were several things that were kind of in place. Electromagnets were in there. People had developed the ability of making vast amounts of cables. The knowledge base was in there. He put it together, and that's how the telegraph was born. Other people had similar ideas at the same time. But the question is now, and this is the question that Singapore is asking, and Rahm Emanuel is asking, Bloomberg asked, that's how Stanford moved into New York, okay? How can you produce a collision of talent in such a way that ideas flourish? And a few times, no one put the Renaissance in northern Italy kind of by design. It just happened. A time that it happened more by design was with the Lunar Society in Birmingham. It was called the Lunar Society because these people will meet only in days of full moon, because they need to walk home, they needed some light. And this is the first time that by design, they were the proto-scientists, like the grandfather of Darwin there, engineers like Watts, the father of steam power, and the other guy, Smeaton, was the first consulting engineer. He made a fortune Okay? And I think people in this room will recognize the last two people in the last row there. These were people who made the stuff, porcelain. Okay? They discovered the secret of what the Chinese had been doing for a long while. So this is the time in which people who studied why things happen, the proto-scientists, met with the people who build things and met with entrepreneurs. And there was an explosion of knowledge in England. This is what produced the Industrial Revolution in some sense. But what's missing from this picture? I would say now, art. Okay? And let me tell you what the art part brings to this. So I didn't kind of stress this, but a lot of what the emphasis on analysis when things bifurcated after Galileo and focused on math was the belief that all discoveries could happen because of using the left side of the brain, the rational side, the mathematical side, the analytical side. And the right side, the most creative, I'm speaking in terms of metaphors in here, was kind of left behind. Okay? But there is something to this metaphor. And I'll give you one example. Okay? So there are people who have studied, usually now in the context of brain plasticity, what happens if you have massive brain loss, if you somehow something happens and you lose completely one side of the brain, and to what extent you can patch up things and the other side will compensate for it in some way. Or for a long, long while, in the 50s, one way to treat epilepsy was by severing the connection between the two hemispheres, cutting what is called the corpus callosum. And one fellow in Caltech, Sperry, got a Nobel Prize in medicine for this, even though there is no medical school in Caltech. Okay? He was using data from other places. So the way that you study this is you give people an input, like the figure that you see there, and then you ask them, what is that you saw? So the people who use only the left side of the brain will see something like this, and the people who use only the side of the brain will see this. So it's details and large picture. And the point that I'm trying to make in here, in life you need both. There is no way that you can instantly parachute and be the big picture person without having gone through details. But if you always get trapped in details, you will always miss the big picture. So I'm going to show you now, quickly, a few things, and then I'll tell you what the lesson is, okay? So these are sketches from Matisse, okay? A few that, in some sense, you can imagine that culminated in this painting, which is in Leningrad, La Danse. But Matisse, who had a long career, he painted until his 90s, showed up every day to his studio and painted. And some days probably was not highly inspired, and painted things in which the painting appears in the background, and here's another one. Okay? This is the lesson. Inspiration is overrated, okay? You don't go and write or paint when you are inspired. You go and work every day, okay? And everybody has a different method, but you have to work constantly. This is Picasso at 15, Picasso at 17, maybe 22, 40. This is the Koning, and you'll recognize the second one. This one is in the Art Institute, Elie de Koning. So I mentioned people working hard. So Leonardo painted about 7 paintings. He was busy doing other things, okay? But there are 7 paintings that people attribute to Leonardo. Vermeer is about 36, but then you go to Van Gogh, which is more typical, and it's about 900 in the last 2.5 days of his life. Picasso who had a long career, started like at 15. He did about something every day and a quarter. And Andy Warhol, I just last week gave a talk in Carnegie Mellon. He's one of the major achievements of Carnegie Mellon. He studied there. He had a shorter career, about 28 years. For 2 years, he did nothing because he had been shot by a fan. Did about an object and a quarter every day of his life. So what's a lesson? Start with a solid grounding and equate creation, which is a byproduct, with hard work. I don't know how many of you have seen this. It's called Baboon and Young. It's Picasso. It's all with found objects. He had a kid, so the head of the baboon became like 2 toy cars, kind of glued together like this, pots and pans. Bad artist copy, great artist steal. This really applies squarely to science and technology. Copying is copying. It's trying to do exactly what someone else did. Stealing is picking pieces and making part of a new whole. There's nothing new. You'll hear this constantly in an iPhone. The secret is on how the pieces get combined. But in the same way that Henry Ford was lucky enough that the combustion engine had been developed, production for petroleum refining was really way up. He picked the concept of the assembly line somewhere, and voila, we had modern production of cars. In all cases, he's picking pieces from different locations. This one is interesting. I presume many of you have seen this at the Art Institute, but the painting is incomplete. The story is that there was a fellow named Bill Hartman, who was a partner in Skidmore, who visited Picasso at his studio in France and mentioned this painting. He had been in, maybe it was in Chicago or something, and Picasso said, yeah, I remember the painting. I had an idea in mind, but when I finished, I thought this didn't really cut it. It was not what I had in mind, so I reworked it. But by the way, if you want the piece that was in the original painting, I'll give it to you. So what happened is that the painting was bigger, and it had another piece, a man holding a fish that the baby was trying to touch, but he arrived at the end. He said, I'm done now. He stepped back, looked at this, and decided that that was not what he wanted, so he cut it and painted it. There are valuable lessons in here. Applies from finished products, quote unquote, works of committee, is do not converge quickly. Step back and look at the entire picture. In my view, this is kind of sweeping. There's nothing that cannot be made better by simplifying it. But the tendency is always to put more. So finally, the last lesson. This is also Picasso. So these are lithographs. But I went quickly, and if you look at the dates, that was the first, second, and this is the last. And in my opinion, the hardest lesson of all is this. And you could give entire talks. In fact, my talk in Carnegie Mellon was about this. In learning to see simplicity in complexity, theory work is like this. There are a whole bunch of disconnected facts, and somehow, when you look at something with the right lens, everything comes clearly. It is this teeny picture that connects all the facts, but you are the only one who sees it. But once the picture is there, how does the picture can be augmented and capture tons of things? As an example, the entire paper of Watson and Crick, the DNA paper, 900 words only. The one who uncovered the structure of the DNA ends with a sentence that is the understatement of the century, okay? It has not escaped our attention that the structure that we propose can have interesting biological consequences. All biotechnology is contained in that picture, okay? So, but from an educational viewpoint, which is So I wear like 3 hats. One is dean, then I work on my own work, research, write papers. The third component is I go and give talks. But from the educational part, if there is something of this that translates to students, is this, is that when people see this, rather than seeing this, they see this. Thank you.